Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm so happy to see the names of people that I actually haven't seen in a few years while I've been hiding out in the academic world. So, hello to all of my friends that I haven't seen in a while, and I hope I'm going to start seeing you at conferences and whatnot again soon. And it's really exciting for me to be here today talking to you about a different dimension of my work that maybe you haven't heard before. And all my friends in Ontario had an opportunity to learn a little bit more about this. So today I've shifted the focus a little bit just for those that got quite an introduction into Indigenous worldview and applying it to invasion biology. So yeah, just to introduce myself again quickly. So my name is Jennifer Grenz, and I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Pentlich speaking people, which is known today as Parksville, British Columbia. So good morning from the West Coast and good afternoon to my East Coast friends. And so I am Inglapamuk. It's not an easy word to pronounce, so no worries there. I'm mixed ancestry, and my family actually comes from the Lytton First Nation, though I grew up on the coast of BC, so I'm known as one of the coastal cousins. And my life has been all about plants from the time that I was very, very small, growing food with my great grandmother in her garden and my grandmother in her garden and canning everything and anything. And these are things that I continue to do with my own family on our small farm. And here's just a little sampling of the kinds of things that we get up to. And I've also been all about plants in my work life. I've been a field practitioner managing invasive species for almost 20 years. My focuses have been on both terrestrial and aquatic species, but I have spent a lot of time with knotweed, and that is probably how many of us have interacted in the past. I've worked extensively on field trials to develop best management practices, as well as doing research on seed ecophysiology of knotweed. And now shifting focus. I'm now part of the below ground ecosystems group at UBC, looking at the soil microbiome of invasive species and culturally important native species. But I'm sure, as all of you agree, working on invasive species is among one of the best jobs ever. The scenery is fantastic, as you can see here. But like anyone involved in invasive plant management, I've been very much involved in the education and advocacy component. We are highly tangled up in that, I think, even when we're, doing work on the ground to do control. So I've been involved in, a number of highly successful campaigns like Alien Busters and Not on My Property. So I like to say that really I've been serving up a heap of hyperbole for a long time. And we need to do that. When we're developing messaging, we have a lot that we have to break through. No matter what the audience is, we are trying to reach people, whether they be politicians with a lot more on their plate than the concern of invasive species, and the general public who have their everyday lives to care about. We have to find effective ways of getting our message through very quickly and effectively. Because some of these species present, high risks. And, there's really nothing wrong with this in that, we have species that we know, have considerable impacts. Like here is where we've got knotweed that has altered the hydrology of a salmon spawning stream. We have other threats to the environment like erosion, turbidity of streams. You can see in this knotweed infestation on the left, this is full sun in July. We have this sort of desert-like effect that happens. It's something I'm actually studying right now. So we do have, plants that are bringing harm that we really need to be concerned about. And we have species, that threaten those that are at risk. I had a little visit with my colleagues in Washington State looking at some of their knotweed treatments, right, where salmon were spawning And these are really important issues that we're working on. And not just threats to the environment, but also threats to infrastructure. This is the infamous knotweed infestation that was at a bridge footing in North Vancouver. And we have species that really, as plant admirers, we have to admire. Knotweed in particular here is growing in darkness. And these are species also that are really difficult to control. And as you know, we also have species that threaten human health. This is an old hogweed infestation that's no longer there on Cypress Mountain. But it's important that, when we're doing this education and advocacy, we are working on really, really important issues. But this is the but. Here's the thing, change is needed in our field of study. And, this education and advocacy that we do, I believe, inhibits our lack of reception to other perspectives and viewpoints. And that advocacy, also has polluted our field. The use of hyperbole has led also to seeing, generalized principles of plant physiology applied to all species. We've generalized impacts, and we've kind of contributed to the development in many respects of what I refer to as an invasive species lore. And again, I'm not undermining, some of these species that have considerable concerns, but I think, it's time to have an honest conversation about how this field of study, which has rapidly evolved, has become tangled up with an advocacy component and what that has done in terms of how we move forward. And this lack of reception, to other viewpoints is something that I've dealt with head on, especially, as I'm introducing the application of an Indigenous worldview, to our field of study. But again, that said, I'm tremendously proud of my work, and I know that I've done a lot of important work along the way, as we all have. And so I'm just going to show you what I refer to as some of my money shots, where we have done some pretty cool and amazing things. Isn't that just like the best before and after picture? Oops, that's an old slide that I borrowed. There's a before and after as well. And here's dead knotweed canes treated right in between native species, right? So this is all feel-good stuff. But it isn't always like that. And we know this, for every one of those good before and afters, I probably have hundreds of ones that didn't work out so well. And I think that it's really important for us to be able to say out loud that we shouldn't be so sure of ourselves, like we talk about when we're in an advocacy role, because it doesn't always go well. And there are species out there that we can't seem to get control of. And then, what do we do when we have new species, showing up as well? And so I'm going to take up some Indigenous teaching pedagogy here and tell you a story, a transformative story for me that is what lent or gave rise to the title of this presentation. It's called A Stranger in the Bush. I pick my way along, making my own path around the rocks and roots and ferns and shrubs and trees. On the hunt, the target set, fixated on the glowing red dot on my iPad map. I have done this long enough that little attention need be paid to my surroundings. I brought my best friend along to assist, her first time out on such a quest. As I moved swiftly, honing in on the bad plants whose demise were imminent, she kept asking me, "What is this?" pointing at the plants and the trees. Ordinarily, such inefficiency would make me annoyed, but for some reason, her interest intrigued me. With my recent pondering on worldviews, I realized that her view provided me a rare opportunity. Ordinarily, I am working with folks who, like me, have spent most of their lives crawling through dense brush. It isn't so much that you take it for granted, but you just don't take it in anymore in its entirety. So I tried to patiently answer her questions. And then I realized I didn't know the answer to a lot of her questions. I looked around through her eyes. I finally saw all the plants, the shrubs, the trees, the mosses, the insects, the fungi. I felt like I needed to introduce myself to them. How is this possible? How did I not know many of them? And the ones I did know felt more like acquaintances I'd met maybe in another context, but couldn't really remember where. Later, I realized that we met while I put together orders of native plants for restoration projects from the lists that I was provided by native plant nurseries. I'd placed check marks next to their names. I had some old friends I could introduce her to, though, the berries I ate with my dad when we fished the rivers and creeks. Those were awkward introductions, though, as I couldn't remember their names. They were just typecast as edible or not. I felt as though my feet left the earth. Disoriented, quickened breath, I glanced down at my iPad and realized that the glowing red dot was within my crosshairs. I looked up. There they were, right where the sun broke through the canopy, the invasive knotweed plants. I breathed a sigh of relief. I felt grounded again. There you are, my enemies. Thank goodness. So this experience happened, for me because the seeds had already been planted to start applying a different worldview and to practice what I call making the old new again. This bridging of worldviews is something that I worked really hard to avoid for a really long time because I was afraid of undermining myself as a scientist. And in fact, that's something I was actually told by someone who is an important role model for me in the weed science world. Watch out for that indigenous stuff. It'll undermine you as a scientist. And I know that he didn't mean any harm by it. It was something stated out of general concern, for my career. But it's that culture, and that fear that makes it very difficult to see your work in a different way, and to learn to embrace it. And what I came to understand, through opening up these types of experiences is that our training and the culture of our field is so deeply ingrained in us, way more than I realized. And so, when I start to introduce something new to you and it feels difficult to kind of, embrace, I totally understand that, because even though I'm an Indigenous woman, I had considerable struggles myself in seeing things differently, in making the old new again. But that story, makes me wonder, what are we missing by othering these species? What are we missing when we only view them as targets? By using this militaristic language, we distance ourselves from our enemy, and if you're going to kill it, then that probably is the right thing to do. But recently, I'm teaching a course called the Western and Indigenous Science of Plants and the Environment at Vancouver Island University. And I had students do what I called a decolonized plant literature review. And what I mean by decolonized literature review was, we chose invasive species. And I said, okay, I want to hear all about this plant, not just the bad stuff. And I sat through what was one of the most enjoyable marking experiences I've ever had, learning things about plants that I have been working on or working against for the last 20 years. And I think that there was a really important lesson in that. What do we miss when we're merely looking for a target? Now, we have to also admit that we have not necessarily been terribly receptive as a field of study to alternative points of view. I highly recommend challenging yourself to read this particular book. But I want to assure you that I'm not going easy on invasive plants here, and I'm not giving them a free pass. I'm certainly not trying to undermine our profession, and I certainly do not have sort of a hippie live and let live perspective. So I just want to remind you really quickly, that is me, and I love nothing more than killing weeds. Okay. So, I just want to keep that perspective. But the fact is, we have to think differently about how we are going about doing what we're doing. We have no choice. It's not about a different perspective. It's about the application of a different lens. The target worldview of invasive species management is no longer serving us. In fact, I believe that it's holding us back. But why can't we have this kind of conversation? Well, our management context, puts us sort of Eltonian researchers and field practitioners on the defensive, right? We have people criticizing the work that we're doing. We have people that are very afraid of herbicide use, in particular, that, we're facing constant challenges from people who are not necessarily researchers. And I think that really does kind of give us sometimes a bit of an elbows up, approach to our work, because we're constantly defending it. But I do think that we have to acknowledge, and I think a lot of us realize this, but again, can't have this conversation, is that our work often sits firmly upon assumptions. This quick development of a field of study, followed by an impassioned rush to action, could be to blame for that. If you start to look into specific species, it is very difficult to find specific impacts, research that is backing up specific impacts. And this is what I was talking about earlier with generalized, impacts being communicated for all species, but I understand why we can't sort of admit these things, right? We don't want to undermine the programs we have worked so hard to build. We don't want to confuse the public. We don't want to confuse funders. We don't want to confuse politicians. But we have to have this conversation. And, the big reason for that is that our climate is changing. We know that we deal with dynamic systems, but we really are dealing with impacts of climate change. And I'd say, anyone that's managing plants, has been talking a long time about changes that they're noticing in the field in real time. We also have we have limited resources. We can't be chasing down every plant. And we don't understand ecosystem level impacts very well. The impacts are not quantified. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that plants are more complicated than what informed our field of study in the beginning. So, the more we learn about plant evolution and, plant community evolution, I feel like the less we know. And so this is something that we have to acknowledge and realize that we're not working in a world of absolutes. We're still learning, and we're learning more and more. We also have food systems that are collapsing. It's a very colonial perspective when we think of just nature as something that doesn't involve humans. But many of the systems that we look at today were purposely shaped by Indigenous peoples, and those were food systems. And one of my good colleagues from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada said, these are degraded food systems. Instead of talking about a degraded ecosystem, these are degraded traditional food systems. And think about how much power, that shift in perspective actually has. And so, I just wonder if the Indigenous worldview is a possible solution, for us to be able to have these difficult conversations. Increasingly people are seeking Indigenous knowledge, and so perhaps are less likely to reject it. And, while sometimes I argue that Indigenous knowledge is becoming fashionable to integrate, I think that it is important to really understand and learn what it is and what its power is in terms of the application of a worldview that can carry these conversations going forward. So this isn't that we are historians telling information about the past, and we can do that, but it's also about how we see the world, which is different. And a lot of people don't understand that. And those are the headwaters, from which our knowledge flows. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. The other reason why we need to have these conversations is we have countless situations like this. What do we do? What do we do about this? And have we stopped to ask why? This is where we have that targeted worldview, I think has an impact on the research questions or the lack of research questions that we ask, right? So we see this and think, that's too bad, right? But we don't have the resources to manage this, but is it okay for us to simply shake our head and say, well, that's too bad? Or is it better for us to maybe ask, what is the forest telling us here? These are Fabaceae plants, beside nutrient deficient forests. And this is really why I believe that the relational worldview, presented by an Indigenous ecology offers us a way to have these conversations and not be threatened by them, but to work in pursuit of adaptability and resiliency of systems, to work beyond this dichotomously guided ecological restoration of good plant and bad plant, right? And so an Indigenous worldview is one that is focused on connections. So it is like if you put glasses on and instead of seeing things and objectifying them in the environment, instead all you see are the tangible connections between everything, between you and the trees and the grass, and it spans space and time. So the connection to your grandmother, your great-grandmother, the ancestors in that particular place. And this is transformative. It brings to life the things that ordinarily we just objectify. It helps us to understand, how what we're doing is more than just targeting a plant. And so I present the application of this relational worldview as a possible solution, but have to point out this is not just a different perspective. It is a different worldview. So a perspective is just a particular attitude towards or a way of regarding something. But a worldview is a particular philosophy of life or conception of the world. And this is, again, what I think people don't understand, which is that Indigenous people see the world differently in this series of relationships. And this is rooted in our verb-based languages. And so English is a noun-based language that objectifies things. So we have like that tree, that rock, that plant, right? That weed, that mountain. Whereas most of our Indigenous languages are verb-based. And so this is quite transformative. So it's not a tree, it's treeing. It's not a weed, it's weeding. It's not a mountain, it's mountaining, right? So, play with that yourself and just feel how transformative that is and how that actually changes how you consider what it is that is around you and your relationships with those things. And, obviously I can't give you a whole lecture on Indigenous research methodology, but this will help you to understand, how I've begun to apply some of this to my own work. So in Indigenous research methodology, we have to adhere to this relational accountability through what I call the 3 R's: respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. And so we have to have respect for what it is that we're researching. The research that we're doing has to give back in some way, whether it be to community, to the land, to waters, to some other relation. And then we have a responsibility to that research to make sure that the work that we're doing is done in a good way. And this is something I actually really struggled with because when you're trained in Western scientific methodology, it's very difficult, because this is taught to you as the absolute truth. And now you're being told to work in a different way that in many ways sort of flies in the face of the very things that you were taught. And I struggled with this for quite a long time. And I actually wrote to Indigenous Professor Peter Cole in the education department at UBC about this struggle. And this is the poem that he sent back to me, written exactly like this. He said, write in your own way, think in your own way, research in your own way. Don't think you have to ask permission. How long does it have to go on for? Quote your elders and your children and the wind, the waves, the clouds. They are always telling you stories, listening to your stories. And that is a really tough thing to do. But through my own experience, what this did for me was the research site that I was working on at the time. I kept bringing my iPad in and laying down a transect and taking data just like I always had. And after this, I stopped bringing my iPad. I stopped bringing my field notebook, and I just sat in different places on the land, and I watched and I listened, and sometimes I closed my eyes, and I gave myself the opportunity to have the time to experience some of these places that I have been treating for like 10 years in an entirely different way. And oh my, I just highly recommend giving yourself that opportunity, because all of a sudden I noticed the plants around my target. I noticed a stream, a little ways down. I noticed the birds on the plants. I noticed, things that I would not have seen because I was driving to a target, dealing with the target, and driving away. And Indigenous research methodology allows us to stop doing that. And so here are just some key differences, just to give you a little bit of a flavor. Key differences between Indigenous research methodology and our dominant research methodology. So the focus is on relationships and knowledge ownership. So in Indigenous research methodology, knowledge is not owned. It belongs to everybody. It is accessible to everyone. And one of the most fundamental things, and I'm sure my practitioner friends will really love this one, is we respect all ways of acquiring knowledge. So I cannot tell you how many times, and I'm going to show you some examples, as a practitioner, I have been communicating issues to people in charge of invasive plant management programs, to researchers saying, hey, I'm seeing this, and feel like my own knowledge as someone who spends all this time on the land is denigrated, right? And then meanwhile, I sit at research conferences where sometimes people are researching issues in invasive plant management that will never fly on the ground. But that's the knowledge that is being embraced. So this really spoke to me, because land-based knowledge is not just reserved for Indigenous people. People that spend time in places. I've started asking dog walkers in some of the parks where we're doing management about changes they've seen, because they walk through there every single day. That is valuable information. And so this is also, the key difference too, is that the stronger your connection to place, the greater the understanding. The research should change you as a person. And a line from Sean Wilson is, if the research doesn't change you, you're doing it wrong. And this is something that's different, than Western scientific methodology that, says that objectivity is the goal. It is not. Say goodbye to objectivity. This is all about, why are you involved in this research? Why is it important to you? What are you trying to do? And of course, many of us that are involved in environmental management, we came to it for a good reason, right? We spent time in the outdoors when we were children. We want to create a better world for our children, and it's okay for us to admit those things. And it's okay for that stuff to influence the research that we're doing. And finally, the major difference too here is that the research that we do is co-developed and co-interpreted start to finish. So if you're working with an Indigenous community, Indigenous peoples are helping to develop the research questions, the methodology, and how we interpret those results. So if you've seen one of my presentations before, I just want you to play along here, but I'm sure you're familiar with these sorts of images where you can see one thing or the other. So I just want you to play along. I'm going to go through these slides. So what you saw was neither right nor wrong. And there's a lot going into informing what it is that you see, right? Or what you saw first, right? So here we have a seal laying on its stomach, or a mule head or donkey head. Okay. And one of the interesting things about these images is sometimes we can only see one thing. We can't see the other thing. But once someone tells us what the other thing is, then we can see it. And then we can actually flip what it is that we're seeing, right? So we can just go back and forth. Seal, donkey, seal, donkey. But that's what I'm trying to help you do, is that making the old new again is to, isn't for us to just say that all of the work that we've done in the past is not important or good and toss it away and do something totally different. No, it's just that perhaps we're limiting ourselves by a singular worldview. And it's not appropriative to apply a relational worldview to your work. But I think this is the most tangible example of what it is that I'm trying to accomplish in talking with you. And so, again, sites that I've been treating for 10 years look different, and this is how this influenced my own research journey. It changed how I chose my research subject. It changed how I went about it. It changed how I interpreted the results. I changed my project so that it would help community. I was working with Cowichan tribes. And it changed how I transferred knowledge. I wrote a book. The book is going to come out. Knopf is actually going to be publishing my book instead of sticking it in scientific journals, because I wanted everyone to have access to that information. And this was all changed because I took a target off of these plants and actually realized that we are managing systems, not plants. And so we have to have a relational worldview in order to do that. So again, what happens when we remove the target and give species what I refer to as relational consideration? Robin Kimmerer, in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, was talking about her experience as an undergraduate student studying plants. She said, the questions scientists raised were not who are you, but what is it? No one asked the plants, what can you tell us? The primary question was, how does it work? The research subjects are reduced to an object. And so my work takes this a step further, and I ask the plants, what's your story? And that is honoring the past, that's honoring the present, but it's also about creating a story going forward. It allows us to actually get to know these plants. And so I use the term relational consideration instead of our sort of classic term of species assessment, because you conduct an assessment with the bias of the reason that you are doing that assessment, which for us in invasive species work is usually a risk assessment. What risks does this plant pose? And this is unpublished work, but in an analysis of risk assessments, and we looked at, I think we're up to about 47 of them, not a single one talks about the possible positives that this plant could offer. Not one. Why? We are changing climate. We have changing systems. We have degraded systems. As an Indigenous person, I say that we are the adaptation experts. We have survived changes of speciation. And, species like Western red cedar 5,000 years ago may have been considered an invasive species here on Vancouver Island. Right? But I want to say that relational consideration doesn't mean a free pass. I'm not saying, let them all in, no problem, let them go. That is not it. It means taking a pause. It's something that I have learned to love about knowledge keepers and elders that I work with and learn from. So often it used to frustrate me, these long pauses, but I realize there is wisdom in the pause. It is to think and consider what it is that we're doing, how we're acting, what we're going to, how we're going to approach something. We have to think beyond generalized impacts of invasive species. And we have to figure out in this relational consideration, how do we introduce nuance to our conversations? You know, who are we listening to? Who is informing what it is that we're doing? What are we watching for? Think about the data that you collect, right? I go out and I'm looking for plants. I'm doing plant surveys, and all I'm doing is surveying the abundance of that plant. How much area is infested? How dense is the infestation? That's it. But what about what's happening to the other species around it? What other species are around it? Are there insects? Are there birds? And also, how much are we, relational consideration for me also has to do with, how much are we investing in practitioner informed research? Not enough, right? Because again, this is what relational consideration is. It's not just for the plant itself, it's in how we're working. What do our risk assessments look like? Are they giving some relational consideration? Do these plants have some important function? Are they filling some need? What is the system telling us by the presence of these particular species? All of this has given me the luxury of stopping to watch things like this, right? This plant is terrible in many respects, or at least I've learned that's the case, But then I was driving up the highway in Vancouver, on Vancouver Island in the north, and all I could see was pollinators. And so I made my husband pull over, which he loves pulling over to have to look at plants constantly. And all I could hear was buzzing. And there were too many species of pollinators to count. And I don't know what that means, but we need to at least think about what it means and look into it, and not maybe apply generalized principles because perhaps one species of plant is not as good of a food source to pollinators. We can't say that's the same for others. So this has made me think and watch the plants around my old targets and think about things like the native seed bank, after we're done. Because this is the other problem with, having a target, is that our job is done after we've dealt with the target. But is that really work that is, embracing reciprocity and respect and responsibility, like Indigenous research methodology calls us to do? And this is where, I think about relational consideration and what it would have done in my own work again, in thinking, these are knotweed seedlings beside some regrowth from root crowns. I was sounding the alarm on this for years before it was taken seriously, So would that have been honored sooner if we had a more relational approach and took the target off and thought maybe we need to understand a little bit more about this species? Maybe. Would we have been able to understand it faster and changed our management practices quicker? Maybe. Maybe we would have gotten to the science a little faster. And this is some of my work on the seed ecophysiology of knotweed. If you haven't seen knotweed seeds germinating, that's what it looks like. What else are we missing? Are we missing the legacy of the soils that we're working in? Are those soils the same as the soils of the ecosystem where we have this sort of colonial understanding of nature, where, we've hit a pause button on the system? This is one of the areas that I was working in that we were trying to restore to Garry Oak ecosystem. And then if you look at the soil beneath their feet, that does not look like Garry Oak sandy, nutrient deficient soils. Well, it was a dairy farm for 100 years, when the settlers came, right? So these are the things that we can miss if we're not honoring all of the relationships to the places that we're trying to bring healing to. And that is what an Indigenous ecology offers us, And one of the things that's important to understand, just as I'm wrapping up here, is that an Indigenous ecology actually gives humans the role of balancers of the system. And I'm not talking about balance in terms of it being static. This is a dynamic balance. And I don't have time to read you the Kwakwakiwak story about this, but basically, without humans, the ecosystem was out of balance. And humans have been given a leadership role, a very difficult leadership role, in establishing a dynamic balance based on meeting the needs of community. And that's all relations. That's not just the human relations, that's the insects, the birds, the fish, the food systems that we care about. And, this is an excellent example where, Garry Oak ecosystems were, the bulb farms of the Cowichan people. And that required human intervention. And here we see an example where we have a native species, behaving invasively. So this is snowberry that is taking over the understory of the Garry Oak system because we are not burning anymore, because we are not maintaining that system. And again, so this relational consideration is so important in our programs because, one of the things that I bumped into in the past as well is that we couldn't manage quote unquote native species, even though they were behaving invasively, because they're not on the list. They're not on the right list. Well, those are good guys. We can't do anything about them. We're kind of, our hands are tied by, how our program is defined. But we have a responsibility in management. So I just want to leave you with thinking, what if we saw plants for what they are instead, without the crosshairs, as difficult as that is. Like, I hate putting food value on invasive plants because it makes my job more difficult to manage them. But there is a food value on some of these plants, like Himalayan blackberry as an example, and work I was doing with an Indigenous community, they wanted it left because it's a source of free food. It's good food. So we figure out how we manage it. It's not black or white, right? It's not good or bad. It's just how we're managing it in that particular place, and to align with the values and needs of the community so that we can, restore systems and get back to, have these traditional food systems in particular are so important, not just to Indigenous communities, to all communities, especially rural communities. And just look with the, increases in price of food, people are going to be turning to these systems even more. And so we have to be thinking relationally instead of, target-based management. And we talk again, like in my own work, looking at the relationship between species that we're managing and, those who are living in those systems, like these Roosevelt elk helped us to find, plant infestations. And instead of working with, maps and, putting transects down, we're like, oh, we're just going to follow the elk trails instead. And boy, then we learned a whole bunch about how elk live. And then we learned about how to predict where these species were going to be at different times of year. But if we hadn't been looking up and thinking relationally, we would not have done that. And so this is where I want, for bridging worldviews is honoring knowledge of those on the ground, that's me, with the science, bringing those two things together. So for me, an application of an Indigenous worldview is this exact thing, is the bringing together of all types of knowledge to complete the puzzle. And so quickly, we define Indigenous ecology as relationally guided healing of our lands, waters, and relations, which brings a desired balance to an ecosystem while respecting and honoring our mutual dependence through reciprocity. And so we can approach, what it is that we're trying to do by thinking, what is the purpose of what we're doing? Because it's not just going after a target. So in this case, this is, the recovery of a Garry Oak system. Well, what needs to happen for that? If we had just thought about the weeds, we would not have been successful. So what do Indigenous knowledge holders think about invasive species? Well, there's no neat and tidy, easy answer to that question. And that was the question of my, the beginning question of my PhD. And it turned out that question actually just really didn't matter that much. And that was embracing Indigenous research methodology. I learned all this other stuff instead that in my mind is way more important. But I'll tell you, there were stories about invasive species that were negative, about where they had, and where medicines had in fact disappeared, where those species had appeared. I'll use Scotch broom as an example. But this man here, my greatest teacher, Lischim, Dr. Arvid Charlie from Cowichan Tribes, told me a story about Scotch broom being used to heal chemical burns on skin that happened from his relatives that were working in strawberry patches in Washington state, and they would come home with these terrible skin conditions they believed from things perhaps that were sprayed on the strawberries. So they would boil the Scotch broom and bathe in it, and it would heal their skin. It's the first time I'd heard a positive story about Scotch broom. But then in the next story, Lischim is telling me that we need to do something about the Scotch broom that is where, they're harvesting a different medicine. So it's not all or nothing, so we have this kind of invasive species, philosophical spectrum of, kill everything that doesn't belong and live and let live. And you're either on one side or the other, but that is not what I found with Indigenous knowledge holders. Their answers were all on the spectrum between those two places, and they changed depending on the context. And I think that's the grand lesson here, is it is okay for us to be context specific in our management. We have to think about the systems as a whole. We have to give relational consideration to those plants and the people around them, and the animals around them, and the insects around them. What are they doing in these degraded systems? So I hope that, as you move forward in your work, that you look at the land a little bit differently, that you give yourself the chance. And I know this is highly inefficient, and perhaps, employers don't like, giving you time to just sit and think and experience, but I guarantee that that investment is worth it, because you'll see things that you never noticed before. You'll hear things you never noticed before. And it will help you to fulfill your role in applying an Indigenous ecology as a leader in the system, to shape these systems towards the story that we're trying to tell, perhaps one of resiliency and adaptability in the way, as we face a changing climate, to meet the needs of community in terms of perhaps, traditional foods or foods for other relations. But we have to work with that relationality. We have to work with that purpose. We have to work with that degree of specificity, and that requires taking the target off the plant. We have too much knowledge from all of the work that we do to limit ourselves in that way. So just wrapping up here, this is about, changing terminology to make it more relational, to move away from transactional, othering and personal terminology that, influences how we do ecological restoration. So I have moved away from using the term ecological restoration, because to me, that is a very colonial term. That is to put something back to some arbitrary point in time, instead of recognizing that we are shaping systems that are dynamic, that can be things other than some aesthetic notion of naturalness, that this is about healing the land and healing the water, and that healing is multidimensional. So it can mean healing community as well as healing the land, right? But ecological restoration tends to leave the people and the relations out. And so again, I move away from native, non-native species to relationally preferred species. What are the species that we welcome into this space that we're working in, right? And again, there are certain species that we have to manage. We know that because we know their specific impacts, but we do tend to use broad strokes to describe this particular grouping of plants. So we we need to think, what are the stories of these places? What are the values of these places? What's the current story? How are the relations doing in this place? What connects us to this place? What do we want the story of this place to be from this point onwards? What can that story be? What are the stories here that we cannot see? These are the things you can think about as you're sitting on the land, as you're talking to community, as you're engaging with people involved in the projects that you are. It's not just about targeting a specific plant. This is about managing systems, and this is about bringing worldviews together to help each other. It illuminates new paths of inquiry and alternate understanding. And that is so important when we are faced with the challenges that we are today. So for me, this is not about undermining science. It's not about undermining our profession. It is about completing the picture. It's about giving ourselves the opportunity to have difficult conversations. It is about giving ourselves the opportunity to get to know these enemies in a different way. And we might come to the same conclusion for some of them. And that's fine, but let's at least have the conversation. Let's get to know these species, in a new way and see how they fit within these systems, that we are working to bring healing to. So thank you so much for spending time with me this morning, this afternoon. And I know that we've got limited time for questions, but I'm also very happy for emails. That's my email address there. And yeah, thank you for spending the time today.